Hello everyone, MasterZeon1001 here, and in this video we'll be talking about how we went from the dpi to the Control D helper to being able to bring the hops drop down and disabling simple helper and going under input and enabling D key helper to now having the D key be the most expansive box helper created so far. And so throughout these videos I'll be going over basically our thought process and what we were going for when we were trying to create this, and how this can basically bring all the best things of Boxcutter into a unified panel for you to adjust on the fly to get the most out of your Boxcutter experience. So whenever it comes to Boxcutter, or HardOps for that matter, one of my favorite comments is, wow, you guys come out with updates so fast. And you know, that's almost funny because a lot of the stuff that we do takes a while to come to the surface, months and months of planning, and then there's like a review process before we actually decide if we want to add that to the lore, if it's going to complicate things, or if it's something that should be reevaluated or rethought out. So typically things in Boxcutter take a bit of a moment. So even this helper that we're looking at, even though we were just previously talking just a few weeks ago about some updates, those were things that were staged for release. However, this thing has been in progress for several months. So let's go ahead and just begin talking about the conceptualization process. So whenever it comes to Boxcutter, I start putting these designs together like in the 3D view, and I pretty much just like took pictures of all sorts of aspects of Boxcutter, just using snipping tools, and then imported images as planes, and then just cut them out and came up with my proposal for what the UI was going to be. As you can see during this, I wanted like a pre-draw UI that was kind of simplified, pretty much almost what we have in the final version, where we had most specific options. However, those options are showing all together, where in the final version they're actually pertinent to each mode. But we see over here on the side that I actually wanted the helper to have a secondary side helper that would have settings pertaining to the main bevel, the secondary bevel, and I definitely wanted to make flipping the bevel a focal point of this new UI. So whenever it came to this, you know, there's always a degree of interpretation between me and everyone else, and in this case this task was actually handed down to Proxy, who is probably my favorite person to reinterpret my task, because we definitely couldn't have let it come out in this form. So if we jump over to the next slide, we see that a little bit of progress has been made on the mini helper, and we began talking about some of the things that we wanted to change with it. So, you know, we want to definitely indicate what shape is going on so users are aware. We want to split the options, because in the future I plan to have so much lore added to every option that users will be able to just quickly get to it. We wanted to put a gap for specifying different things about the UI. So, you know, I'm just showing you our process. I probably don't have to go over every single little thing, but just a little bit about kind of our thought process and how it evolved as we collaborated on this. So, you know, when we were working, the concept of not having a double window came up, and Proxy pretty much rejected that idea immediately, and that's how sliders came into being. We realized that, hey, if we created collapsible little sliders that had all of their functionality inside, we could offer the most pertinent options up front and offer a more expansive experience whenever you expand it, reducing the amount of hotkeys, but also kind of centralizing things into a really generalized form. So if we jump over to the next slide, we see that things have progressed even more, and we see that, you know, for dimensions, we haven't yet began putting options on the sliders themselves, so everything was kept fairly simple. We see also in this one that rotate angle still had its preferences attached, like its quick press as well as a manual number. It seemed crazy at the time, but I was pretty adamant about replacing this with only presets, and that we can have a drop down happen for the actual number. But the goal was to make each slider take up only a preset amount of space, because we have no idea how long this is going to be as time goes on, so we definitely want to get as many options on it as possible. In fact, even now looking at this, I look at solver and I think, wow, there's not enough options added to the solver slider. We should have non-destructive on here. We should just turn this into the Boolean slider and just have non-destructive, wire display, live, and also specifying your solver. But if we do that, we wouldn't have any room for text, thus causing a need for explanation. So if we move over again, we're looking at one of the final slides I have here of our work in progress. And for this one, we can see the bevel in a state where we just kept the bevels as just sliders, and there were no options on the outside, which just was not going to be able to go. when I looked at it, I realized I was like, we could get so much utility on every single line that every single line justifies its existence by having even more progress to be able to go through. So I believe that's the last slide. So now if I minimize Blender, we have, you know, this pew pew in the background, but if we minimize this, we actually have my Blender scene where I made the UI. And so this is kind of my process for designing UI. If I'm not doing it on the iPad, I'm actually in Blender just taking screenshots and box cutting in destructive mode, cutting these things out and then moving them around, taking pictures of Blender's UI to specify which icons I want to use. And, you know, I just thought it'd be fun to just show a little bit about the work in progress of the UI as well as the amount of planning that goes into it, because it definitely was in planning for quite a few months, and the process of execution took even longer, and there was a very long pass of us resolving bugs and just getting things in fighting order for it to be as fluid as it is in the way that we're about to be showing it. But just to let you know that, you know, these updates, while they may get deployed quickly, definitely take a long time to stage up. In fact, we have a couple of very large features that I'm excited about that we should just drop anytime, but really we want to wait for the right moment and right way to add them to our tools, so that way they feel more integral instead of being tacked on. So that's an important part for us with Boxcutter, is having a integrated experience and having everything feel natural and connected. So when you swap between shapes, it's not a jarring experience, it's smooth, and that you're able to avoid hotlining and have your shape look good at all times. These are the things that are important to us in the Boxcutter experience, as well as providing the most pertinent information relevant to your operation in front of your face at all times. One of the most important parts to this UI for me was specifying local and having local right in front of the user's face, because by being able to press D and go in and specify what your orientation is going to be, that is how you truly get control over Boxcutter. So if you're in nearest edge, you can just press D, quickly go in and change this. You only have to press Shift V is the goal with this. In fact, for me, I wanted to have object as a option and local as an option, but we see that in the final cut, in order to get everything to fit and also be in a nice, concise manner, it's just been consolidated to object, with the submenu options actually being inside of it. But just like that, that is how the Boxcutter helper version 2 came out. So if I go under the behavior sprocket and we expand on display and we enable simple helper, with this in conjunction with D helper under input means that whenever I press D, we can actually bring up the classic Boxcutter helper. Whenever it came to this helper, we initially created it very early on in Boxcutter's rebirth in 2.8, and we wanted to try to add some of the most important options to the user experience for them to be able to adjust on the fly. For example, if we press D and we change over to box, we can draw box. Press H to make it solid, we can press tab. Let's go inside our helper, we're able to check wedge. We're able to adjust the factor of our wedge very quickly just on the fly by getting in here. We even expanded on wedge by allowing users to be able to adjust the width on the fly. In addition to that, there's also options for users to be able to choose the snap angle that it snaps to whenever you press R to rotate. For example, we default to 15, but if we change it to something like 45, whenever I press R, we see that it snaps to 45, making rotation a lot easier. If I were to set it to 90, then rotation's even simpler, where basically a very small gesture is able to get this rotate around 180 degrees. So we'll just set that back to 15. The other thing is that tapering is enabled inside of this little mini helper during the draw. So just by clicking it, we're able to taper the shape. We're also able to drag the slider in order to taper it. And taper is a little bit different than wedge as far as how it's coded into Boxcutter. So its behavior is more akin to a modifier than it is to a shape modifier, which is something that we consider wedge to be. So also, taper doesn't persist across operations. For example, if we applied, wedge would continue being a thing, but taper would not. And that's where the persistent toggle comes in. If we were to check this and we complete the operation, then the next drawing we bring in will also be tapered and wedge. So we can just continuously taper and wedge. However, over time with Boxcutter, our needs for the helper grew and grew. For example, whenever we added grid, it definitely became apparent that the miniature helper that we had and the options that we aim to contain is a little bit menu blinding to users, and we needed something a little bit more contained, a little bit more flowing to get the intended box cutter experience across. And it also goes without saying that when we expanded on collections and added the ability to set up recall collections, that it also just made things all the more messier. And we could see that even though this is a very small panel, there's just a better way that this information could be conveyed to you, the user, and configured and dealt with on the fly that's probably a little bit more flowing. But that's pretty much where this mini helper ends, and more than likely we'll revisit this in the future and try to make a new miniature version. However, if you were to go under your display and you check simple helper, whenever you press D, you'll actually see that the new helper is just as accommodating as the old one. In fact, all the shape modifiers are just stacked up, and we can even just click X to remove all of them, taking us back to a vanilla box, and we can just begin working because we know for sure that we removed all those statuses by removing the X's for these particular shape modifiers in this particular instance. So as far as information conveyance, that's always our number one goal, but I wanted to do a small segment just talking about the mini helper and what led us to get to this point. So whenever it comes to Boxcutter, the shapes has always been located in this area of the top bar, and then we've tried to streamline it through the pie menu by allowing users to quickly change their shape on the fly. However, now inside of the D helper, we see that all the shapes are listed along the side. And really, in my opinion, I feel the best way to experience the shapes in Boxcutter is alt scrolling. Basically, holding alt and scrolling will allow you to jump through any shape you want on the fly. In fact, that is the first hotkey we'll be discussing. So now I'm drawing a box. However, this box is tapered, so we'll uncheck persistent and click the X to remove the tapering inside of this mini helper, but box is the first one. If we alt scroll, we could jump to line box, the second shape. The thing about line box is you're able to basically draw a line in any direction, and then from there it turns itself into a box. So the idea behind it was to be able to get a line that's really useful whenever it comes to drawing angles. So with this bevel enabled, we're just going to press D and click on the reverse bevel, or click on the Q bevel icon, and now that there's a second bevel, we're just going to choose to reverse it, and now we have a reverse bevel. We'll just click to apply. Let's alt scroll and we'll jump to the next shape. Wedge is one of my favorite shapes. If we hold control, we can jump off of this dot and bring down a wedge. By holding control, we can actually draw a perfect wedge that will snap to a 90-degree angle. And from here, we can alt scroll to the next shape. Custom is capable of using itself as a custom cutter. However, we'll be talking about that more in depth later. But the main thing about this shape is that you can hold shift whenever you're drawing it to actually get an equidistant draw. And whenever you're extruding it, you can hold control in order to snap it one-to-one. So the goal is to get it away from shift to live, but there are one-to-one solutions available with custom as well. So we've expanded on it with auto depth and stuff in the past. So if we press D, we see that laser cut is an option. However, if we toggle this option at the end, we actually enable auto depth, which means that there's also the option for custom one-to-one on auto depth, now part of the D helper. So this means that if I just click and drag, we're just creating this custom cutter to depth, and that's one of my favorite shapes inside of Boxcutter. But I've always wanted to expand on the one-to-one behavior to make it feel a lot more custom and a lot more fitting, definitely more unique than Box. However, right now it is still in the shadow of Box, but we'll see how it progresses as time goes on. We'll hold Alt and we'll jump over to N-gon line. N-gon line is basically a line in the form of N-gon. So you can just draw a line. You can press backspace on your points to go back to a previous one. If we weren't working on this D helper, we would be adding the ability to bevel individual points, but stay tuned, you'll be seeing it in a future version. By pressing E, we can jump to extrusion. However, let's actually take this extrusion back all the way to the top, and if we use the D helper, we can actually just expand on the extrusion as far as the Z depth goes, as far as dimensions is, and not have to worry about going through and actually pressing any hotkeys. So we're also able to deal with the extrusion phase in the helper. So if we click and apply, that's basically N-gon line in a nutshell. The next one is Lasso. So Lasso is one of my favorites. However, I don't get a lot of chances to talk about it, but just by being able to click and drag, we're able to draw an equidistant line, and then we can just click and drag this dot in order to extrude, which can be useful for getting really nice freehand strokes. I still feel that there's a hard surface journey that this is able to go through to be taken truly to the next level. If we alt scroll again, we could jump up to star, which is a variant of circle. This was added as of the last release, and right now we see that our star is set to 64 vertices. That's actually too many. Let's press D and change that to something like 6. And whenever we draw a star, we actually get something a little more sensical instead of nonsensical. Let's right click, cancel that. We'll press D, and we want to turn off auto depth because, auto depth was just for the instance of talking with custom, but auto depth does support all shapes, but we'll be going into that more in depth later. If we extrude it down, we could just press tab and pause it. We could press D, go in our helper. We could choose to taper it if we want. We could jump between the presets. 1 is actually the preset to remove it, so keep that in mind. Clicking 1 will just remove taper because no taper is basically 1. But we can get in here and actually adjust our values to get something a little more customized. Even play with our dimension Z, which dimensions looks different for circle because circle doesn't need X and Y. If you do need X and Y for circle, you can expand the dimensions, but typically circle has been simplified to diameter to allow users to input specifically the numerical value that they want when it comes to circular objects. So let's just click and we have finished this. Let's alt scroll, we jump up to the next shape, and that is circle. Circle has went through quite a few changes. As of canon, default circle is now polygon circle. And modifier circle is circle M. So if you see circle M, that means that you're using the classic modifier based circle. This isn't capable of reverse bevel, which is more than likely why you want to be using polygon circle. But we added the enum for changing it on the fly in front of users for them to be able to quickly get to whatever type of circle they desire. However, for this, we'll be keeping it on polygon. And let's set our segments to something like 32. And if we click and drag, we can create our circle. And the best part about circle in this update is that by pressing D, we can go in and adjust our bevel just by moving the mouse, get the amount of segments that we want, press tab to pause, press D, and we see that the bevel offers us options for basically flipping the shape, which gives us a reverse bevel. We can adjust the width, and even better than that, we can unclamp the bevel whenever we're doing a reverse bevel in order to get results that are just really not supposed to happen whenever it comes to the bevel modifier by breaking the clamp. The last thing to do is to add reverse bevel to N-gon and Lasso, but we'll be dealing with that at a later time. But with that, we have went through a guided tour of basically all of the shapes available whenever you alt scroll in Boxcutter. And the thing is that while I showed you how alt scrolling is the best way to go through the best of what Boxcutter has to offer as far as the tools are concerned when it comes to going through the different shapes, if we press D, we see that these options are lining the side. So we can do the same thing. We can go inside of circle, we could change it to polygon, and now we're drawing a polygon circle. We could change it to star, lower our segments, and we're able to do it just all inside of this easy, nifty strip. In fact, most of the time, you shouldn't even have to expand it out, but we do offer expanded prefs, which we'll be expanding on multifold over the next releases. I mean, I see a plethora of things that has to be done in order to take this thing truly to the final level, but I'm so proud of the work that has gone into it. But just like that, we can get in and just change our shapes on the fly. We can quickly make it a line shape. For circle, there's also the ability to draw line circles, not saying that you should do it, but in the event that you want to draw a circle just like you would a line box, or even draw a custom shape just like you would a line box, you're able to do that inside of this little mini helper. So the goal is to definitely give you the best of everything and pretty much access to everything available inside of Boxcutter as far as these shapes are concerned, all inside of this mini helper. In fact, if we click on box and we click on grid, we're now drawing a grid shape. We can click and drag and we're drawing a grid. We can press tab and pause this. We can press D and we see that this grid that we drew also has solidification, meaning that we can expand on the solidification by clicking and dragging in order to make it even thicker. We can adjust our divisions on the fly, and the best part of it all is that we can just click X and just remove grid. Grid has solidify attached to it, so removing grid is going to remove solidify. But if I want solidify back, then that brings us to the next point where we're going to be talking about modifiers. So if we press D and we look at our helper, we see that whenever you're in box, you have an additional type of shape modification called grid. However, when you jump to something like custom doesn't actually have the grid modification, but it does have its own custom slider. In fact, N-gon also has its own custom slider, and Circle has its own custom slider. However, Box does not have its own custom slider, which makes it kind of lonely. But whenever we're looking at custom, we see that with its slider, we're able to go in and specify which shape we want to do. But this little button at the end replaces the hotkey of C. Basically, by clicking this, we can mark a shape as a custom cutter, and every time we cut, the shape that we're cutting is actually being used as the custom cutter, which can be used to get some really interesting procedural combinations if you're just getting started with when it comes to Boxcutter, just looking for a fun time. Playing with custom cutter, self-cut is just definitely one of those ways. However, it does have some more serious uses. You can also go in and just quickly remove a shape from being a custom cutter, which is just so nice, because whenever a shape isn't marked as a custom cutter, you're able to draw using the Boxcutter logo. And so, however, after you draw the Boxcutter logo, more than likely your shape will revert to your previous custom cutter, because there is not a condition for permanently drawing the Boxcutter logo. Typically, we assume that you only want to draw the Boxcutter logo once. It's just a test cutter of sorts, but really once you begin using it, it's probably going to revert back to your previous custom cutter. But just a little bit about custom cutter and why it has its own slider. Sometimes on the fly, you really just want to get in here and just specify what you want to be your custom cutter by clicking the plus button. Also, the C keys still is existent. We're not replacing any of the hotkeys. We're simply just centralizing the ability to use Boxcutter without as much knowledge of hotkeys being required. So changing to N-gon is as easy as just pressing D and just changing your shape over to N-gon. We see that N-gon gets its own slider, and if we click on the N-gon name or even the little arrow at the end, we see that it expands to give us additional options. For example, with N-gon, we have a behavior where you can make N-gon snap to the previous edge that you drew, which is the former behavior that drove people crazy. Now Boxcutter actually tries to orient itself to a kind of world center, which results in a more well-oriented cut. So if you do want the previous system, there's still a toggle for it, but really there's no need for it because we considered that a bit of a bug before. The other thing is that whenever you're drawing with N-gon, you are able to just draw freely, and then holding control, you're able to begin snapping to an angle. If you're wondering why my shape is a wire, that's because I need to press H and we can make it back solid. But whenever you generally are drawing with N-gon, you're able to hold control in order to snap to an angle. And sometimes holding down control in order to snap to an angle is a little bit tedious. So for that reason, this option for angle lock is there, where basically by enabling it, you can draw an N-gon without the need of having to hold control. So I found this to be important enough to be added to the N-gon slider, so users can just go in and actually toggle this behavior on the fly. The good thing about it is it actually reverses the behavior, meaning that if you were wanting to draw a free line, you could just hold control and freely draw a line. So we can draw it at any angle that we want. And the best part is no matter how oddly we drew that previous line, because we don't have previous edge snapping, we're able to still orient this to what we would consider straight Z in this particular orientation that we're drawing it at this time. So just a case of why we actually have a toggle for previous edge is that reason. The other thing is that if you wanted to toggle between cyclic and non-cyclic, which basically makes your N-gon a line or a closed shape, there's an option for it here along with Lasso, which we see is also part of its slider. However, just by clicking this option, we can now just draw an N-gon line, and by pressing right click to just pause after drawing that last point, we could press D and we see that there's an option for solidification. And if we want to begin extruding, all we have to do is just begin cranking the depth and we've began the extrusion process. So we can do everything from the helper whenever it comes dealing with N-gon. So it's a centralized location for pretty much dealing with everything. And hopefully as things expand in the future, we continue to add on to the helper to keep everything centralized, reducing the amount of key overhead for new users. So by clicking and applying, we can actually turn cyclic back on, which results in a closed shape. And then the next toggle we'll be talking about with N-gon is Lasso. So just by clicking this, we can just quickly just change to a lasso, click and apply, and cut this through. This is a shape that I use in all sorts of scenarios of just getting free-form cuts out of organic shapes, but can definitely be a bit of an enigma. So whenever it comes to Lasso, if we click on it, we see that there's an option for adaptive, which will basically calculate your dots in accordance with how zoomed in you are on the mesh. And then there's your spacing parameter, which adaptive was built to actually mitigate the need of having to adjust your spacing. So if we collapse it, we see that spacing is available, but adaptive isn't, because adaptive is aimed to be kept on at all times. Otherwise, you would get a little bit more unsatisfactory resolutions. So with that covers basically Lasso and its slider and the options associated with it in the D-Helper, and how it's all been centralized to make your life a little bit easier. So whenever it comes to the D-Helper, there's also a slider for circle. So like I said, Box is the only one that doesn't get a slider, so I'm going to be pondering a slider of specialized modifier settings to affect only Box, because Box is so near and dear to me. Look at me talking about Box, even in the circle segment, I'll stop. So with circle, the main thing about circle is that there's quick preferences for you to click to quickly adjust your segment count on the fly, because whenever you're using Boxcutter, instead of typing things in manually, I found it easier to just be able to quickly just change it on the fly without having to type in numbers. However, if you are needing to type numbers, you are able to do that. In addition to that, we see that the diameter is also able to be adjusted inside the settings of circle, in addition to it being one of the dimensions that is available. The thing about vertices is that while you see that we're going from 3 to 64, that isn't actually the limit. If you're a mad lad, you can type in 128. If you're a super mad lad, you can type in 256. And if you're just trying to test our limits, you can type in 512. And that's actually the limit of circles for vertices for circle at this time, in case you're making a spaceship or something. But the coolest part about circle to me is that we can press D, we can click on bevel to just start adjusting a bevel. Of course, we have 512 verts, so this is going to perform a little slow, but we could press tab to pause, we could press D, go back into the helper, we can choose to flip the shape, which will give us a reverse bevel, and we can actually adjust it on the fly. And in the previous update logs, I was talking about how when it came to the reverse bevel, we weren't able to actually adjust the segment count for the reverse bevel, but we see that in this update, segments is now front and center, and you can adjust them to your heart's content to allow you to get the reverse bevel in the method that it was intended to. Previously, you would get reverse bevels and they would be really rounded. We would press B, Q in order to do it, and then as you roll the wheel, you would get your reverse bevel. You could press Shift F in order to basically flip it, and this really isn't the designated reverse bevel to me. Being able to press D and go inside the settings and just scroll the segments down on basically only the secondary segments is exactly what we were going for with this particular update. Whenever it comes to snapping, that is also something we wanted to be able to deal with through the D-Helper. So if we press D and we bring up the BoxHelper, we can click on the magnet icon in the sidebar, and we are able to enable the slider for snapping. Right now we see that we're in static dots, so we can go in our intimate settings and toggle off the static behavior for dots, which gives us just regular dots. Of course, with dots we can toggle off the behaviors of snapping to verts, edges, or faces whenever we hold control. But you have absolute control over your snap settings even inside of this little miniature helper. So if we click on grid, we see that the icons for snapping with dots have changed to the dimensions itself. So now whenever we hold control and we're hovering over the mesh, we're able to snap our grid to the mesh. However, if we start drawing with our cursor off of the mesh, we are drawing a grid to view. We can also see at the top that the text is shown red for view, letting us know that we've brought up the grid in a case where it had to override the settings that you had specified because there was no mesh underneath in order for it to ray trace, causing it to default to view. But whenever it comes to snapping, all those settings have been consolidated here, and they're still the same as they were in the previous versions where we were talking about expanding on snap. So if you decide that you're the type of person who wants to use a static grid, you can go in and still enable static grid and bring up your static grid, pause it with right click, shift right click to drag it out, and just begin dragging and creating your shapes even on the static grid. So all the settings that you're used to are still available to you, with increased flexibility of being able to get to those settings whenever you need them. For now, we see that during draw, there's no access to the snap settings because they're irrelevant during the draw. Our goal is to keep the helper optimized towards the settings that you're actually needing to adjust pertaining to the operation at hand. So let's just click and apply, and we see that our grid is back up. If we press D, we can go back in and adjust our snap settings. If we want, we could toggle from grid back to dots. It'll let us know that we are in dots. We even have an option for locking the grid. So if we click on this, we now have grid lock, meaning that if we press Control, the grid is now locked to our cursor, which is an alternative state of interaction that we're experimenting with, but it's still incomplete. But for users who want to try it out and minimize and see what it's like to minimize the usage of control whenever it comes to snapping with grid, give it a try. However, you can always press D, go back to the snap slider, toggle off the icon for locking it, and you're back to regular grid, and we can just jump over to grid and use it just as normal. So the same settings that you're used to and familiar with are still there. However, we wanted to provide them in the form of a slider for users to be able to rapidly and quickly adjust them on the fly. And then of course, if you don't want any snapping, you can just toggle off the magnet, and we see that the slider has been removed, allowing us to get back to work. So if you opened the helper and the first thing you did was this, let's talk about it, because there's a lot of things that's happening inside of the helper and systems that we're forcing to behave as systems that they are not, and really it's quite nice to see them all play together, but understanding it will definitely help you have a better experience whenever it comes to the mini helper. So we'll jump over to Box for formality's sake, and also because Box has an additional shape modifier we could talk about. So we talked about our shapes, we talked about snap, how you can enable snap and have a snap ribbon on the fly, or a snap slider, and then now we're talking about shape modifiers. So these are different from our actual modifiers, which are what we consider start states. What I mean by this is that we can actually click and drag through all of these to enable them at once. However, we can't have solidify, mirror, array, and bevel all enabled at the same time. However, we'll more than likely be talking about that in the future. That doesn't mean that you can't have solidify and array at the same time. It just means that you have to draw out in an array shape, and then you add a bevel to it, and then you add a mirror to it, and then you add a solidified to it, all in succession as you're working. You can't do it as a pre-draw state, because it would result in a pretty wacky shape. In fact, for example, because we have these three all enabled at the same time, let's just also put array in there, and let's just see how terrible it comes out. So this is what happens whenever you wedge and you taper and you box grid and you array all at the same time. However, once we begin extruding, things look a lot more sane. So I feel that we could probably just make the 2D state of this particular situation look a lot better, but that's a story for another day. But as you can see, you can actually start with multiple start states, and we can press V to turn this into a radial array, or we could have actually went in and toggled the behavior for radial array inside of the helper and then adjusted the distance using a parameter. However, whenever it comes to these modifiers, it's just important to point out that they are start state still. And in fact, as you hover over them, they say start operation, meaning that you can have this as your start operation whenever you're working, and that will just be a thing. However, unlike shape modifiers, you can't have them all turned on at once, but more than likely we'll be addressing this in the future. But if I wanted to draw a shape that was already pre-arrayed, I can, and then if I want to bevel it, I would just press B in order to just begin adjusting the bevel. And then I could just always press D and even go in here at this point and add a bevel and begin adjusting it in the viewport. Whenever I click, it drops it into a pause state, allowing me to press D and go in and adjust things more intimately, like control scrolling over the segments or control scrolling over the width in order to grow it or shrink it. But we can also get in here and shift drag on the array in order to adjust this distance, and even control scroll over the axes to change which axes that we're dealing with. So there's a lot more versatility whenever it comes to dealing with stacking these things by multiples. So we'll be seeing how the future comes for it, but more than likely that's one of the first things you'll notice whenever you're using the new helper, is that you can toggle through all of these, you can stack all of these, but you can only toggle through all the modifiers. And it's a very popular question as to why we don't have the ability to support multiple modifiers at this time, and it's just something of a rewrite that we're going to have to do on one of our previous systems, but we'll be revisiting it in due time. So whenever you press D and bring up the helper, the first line is the most important. This contains your mode information, your shape information, your orientation information that you can change on the fly, the ability to pause, and your behavior sprocket, which I feel is the perfect corner piece of any Boxcutter issue. UI. So whenever it comes to dealing with this, you'll see that the shape information changes on the fly. For example, whenever we use circle, we see that it says circle. It lets us know via a P or an M that we're using polygon or modifier. It will even change its name if you change it to star, letting you know that you're in the star configuration of circle. However, with polygon, it simply reverts back to being simply circle. We see that the vert count of the circle is also listed at the top, which we can see updates as we click on the various presets for it. But my favorite is the ability to quickly get in and adjust the orientation. Previously, whenever it came to adjusting the orientation settings for Boxcutter, you could press Shift V, for example, and change your orientation to view in the event that you wanted to just draw a view-based cut without having to orient yourself to the surface. Well, now you can also press D and just quickly change your orientation on the fly, whether it be object and you deal with nearest, local, or longest, which I covered in depth in previous videos about orientation, or jump over to view utilizing cursor or world, which are our fallbacks for whenever nothing is selected. But if you need to change this on the fly, it's now easier than ever in this new Boxcutter BoxHelper. And we see that the ability to pause shapes is also important to us as well. In fact, the only thing that really isn't present in this on the fly is the non-destructive destructive toggle. However, if we expand on the behavior sprocket, we see that it is available right here, along with the ability for us to perform and apply on this, which also deletes the booleans associated. So in the event that you ever need to perform apply, you can always do it under the sprocket, but these are options at the top of the top bar that have been there forever. But whenever it comes to dealing with your intimate settings of Boxcutter, the first line I feel is the most important because it gives us all the most intimate information about the status of your shape and what settings you have set up for it. The only thing that would make it even better is if we listed modifiers, but really there's no room for such a thing. The next line of the helper is modes. So we'll click and drag and create a shape, just clicking and dragging, and we'll press tab to pause, and we'll press D, and we'll now talk about mode. So in the middle of a drawing, we see that the helper looks a little bit different. It's a little bit shorter, but we're able to click and toggle through the different modes. So right now we see that I'm able to toggle through the modes, but it's not actually updating on the fly. So this is one of the things that is kind of variable whenever it comes to the new helper, where sometimes you have to mouse over the view in order for it to register. And then from there, you're able to adjust things on the fly. For example, we've changed ourselves over to inset, and we're now able to adjust our thickness on the fly. However, now that it's actually updated, we could change ourselves back to cut, and it requires that we hover over the 3D view. And now we're able to toggle through these on the fly. In fact, we can just click and drag, and it's able to let us toggle through these on the fly. However, the most important part about listing all of our modes at the top is the sub options of our specific settings for particular modes that you can now activate without having to click hotkeys. So previously, inset slice was marked to Alt X. So if we press Alt X, we see that we're able to get back our slice and we can toggle it back off. That hotkey has now been delegated to just a checkbox that users can now inset, press D, go in and just toggle between inset slice, and even press Alt Z to see through, and you could press D to go back inside and adjust the thickness of it on the fly, removing the use of having to press the hotkey of T. Now, we don't plan on removing any of the hotkeys that are acquainted with Boxcutter. However, our goal is definitely to make it where you're still able to perform every action capable of a hotkey, even without having to know the hotkey. Another part of Boxcutter that I'm quite a big fan of is that you can now change over to knife. And whenever you're in knife, you have the option for hops mark. So if we press D to bring up our helper, we see that hops mark is here, which is unlocked via having HardOps enabled and having hops mark sharp options enabled for what edges you would like to mark. So if I were to click, we see that we've now marked the boundaries of this edge with the same settings that we would use inside the sharp options of the control tilde helper, which is what the box helper is heavily derived from. Another thing is that inset or extract has the ability to use surface extract, which is one of our behaviors. We did a very long video in the past talking about the differences between surface extract and regular extract, which is the difference is basically filtering out only Boolean. Surface extract allows extract to take an entire surface. So even if I were to manually model something in, let's just do a quick demonstration of this, but if I were to press Q, use HardOps to turn this into a circle, and we extrude this, we're definitely creating this area not using Booleans. We're using just regular old geometry, which is a classic fallback for things in the event that they fail. However, in the event that we wanted to repeat this, we can just simply draw a shape over it, extract it, we see the extraction of what was taken, and whenever we draw, we're simply able to repeat this piece even though it was geometrically modeled into the shape. So that's really the difference between extract and surface extract. If we were to turn this off and we extracted this, we are simply whiffing just pieces of air, and the results are just not even worth talking about. So for everyone's sake, you definitely want to be using surface extract whenever it comes to extract. But the access to all of these little minor settings that are associated with each of our individual tools is now accessible for users to be able to access and jump to on the fly without a whole lot of rigmarole. Another favorite of mine is recut. To demonstrate recut in the context that I always use it, we can press D, change over to box. Let's enable snapping, but we want to turn off snapping with grid and use dots. So we can hold control, use this dot to jump off. We could draw our shape, press D, activate wedge, click to apply, and from here we can just draw our box, but we want to press W at least to get rid of wedge and revert it back to box. So if we cut this down, we could press D, go in our helper, change to slice, activate recut, and from here begin adjusting a bevel on this. So we're basically cutting out a slice, but we're referring to a piece that is unmodified by Booleans, giving us a rather unique slice. So these settings are now easier to access than ever, and that's why this is the second row of the BoxHelper. So the next line we'll be talking about is the draw origins, the shape modifiers, and the set origin areas of Boxcutter. So this refers to how you draw your shape. Currently we're set to corner draw, which means when I click and drag, after selecting my shape of course, when we click and drag, we are drawing from the corner. Alternative to this, we can draw from center, which means when I click and drag, the shape comes out from center. I can hold Alt in order to move it freely, or I can hold Shift in order to draw it from a different corner. However, that's what the draw origins represent. So default box will draw at corner, but if you ever need to draw it from center, you're able to just by toggling this option. Another thing is that with dynamic dots, which is the current default system of Boxcutter, if you begin drawing from an edge dot, you'll begin using a center draw instead of drawing from the corner, which will allow you to draw things out evenly from an edge dot, making this maneuver a lot easier. The next thing I want to talk about is the draw line. So draw line is a modification type of circle, box, and custom. So by basically enabling this, it means that whenever you click and drag, you're creating a line and then you're creating your shape. So custom is one of my favorites to be using this with as well. However, box is what it was actually made for, just to be able to draw a line at any angle and then from there draw out your box. Is a lot different than actually just drawing a box and rotating it and moving it around in order to get it to the position you want. Line box aims to basically add a lot more flexibility to the initial draw operation to make it easier for you to get to where you're going without having to bring in the whole rotation business. So whenever it comes to draw modifications, that one is pretty self-explanatory. So we can just toggle that back off. The third one is one of my favorites. This one determines the orientation of the origin and where it's going to be post operation and also during draw. So generally we have this set to centered, which means that if we draw this shape and we extrude it and we press tab, that means whenever we press scale, we're actually scaling it on the center of the surface of the face that we drew. Alternative to this, we can actually set it to something like the mouse, and this actually will allow us to scale it from the origin where we first drew the shape. If we were to press D again and we change this to bounding box center, we're now scaling it according to a devolume center of the shape that we drew. And then finally, you can actually set it to the active element, and now the orientation of this is set to the object that we drew, meaning that when I scale, we're scaling towards the center of this object, this target object's origin. So these options are important to be able to change on the fly, and for that reason, that is the third slider at the top of the BoxHelper. So now we finally get to talk about some of the meat. So if we press D, we can bring up the helper again, and we're looking at the collection slider. And you might think, hey, this is the slider for the collection where we place our cutters, that would be wrong. This is actually the recall collection, which now has a higher importance in Boxcutter, which I'll be emphasizing more in the future. One of my favorite buttons with the collection is the ability to be able to click and change what color my collection for cutters is. Usually I always have it as red, but sometimes I just change it on the fly. In this latest update, we actually made it where whenever you change the collection color, it actually updates the collection on the fly. So that means that, let's draw this, we see that we have a blue cutter collection. If I were to press D and we change this over to orange, we see that the collection in the outliner is now orange. If we press D and we change it to blue, it's now blue. It's just a small thing, but it's one of those things that I love. But let's talk about recall collections and why it's a thing now. So if we press Shift A, we can add a plane. I'll press GX, move this plane over to the side. We'll press Alt X using HardOps and put a mirror on it. And we'll press Shift D, move this one over, and press Shift R to repeat that operation. So now we have a mirrored plane, and we have 3 mirrored planes. So I'm just going to use Box, and we're just going to perform a couple of cuts on them, just random. Mirror, just making our lives a little bit easier. Boxcutter, of course, supports 2D cutting, so we're just getting in here and just cutting some designs. You know, nothing major, just something to play with. And let's take these 3 and we will now move them to a new collection just called Extra, read all about it. We'll press 1 to go back to our main collection, and if we were to press D now and we change our collection over to extras, this doesn't really show anything really in particular. However, if we were to say draw a box and we get the box exactly where we want, we can now press D and we see that the options for origin have moved out the way and given way to shape recall options. These are normally delegated to alt scrolling in order to scroll through whatever collection you have marked as your recall, but now there's arrows, which is something that I'm just such a big fan of. This was one of the preliminary things in the sketches that I wanted added, and just being able to have these in front of the user for them to be able to click on the fly is just amazing. So here we are just clicking through the various presets that are available in the collection that we just set up, and even better, we can click on rotate inside, which is delegated to Shift R and also Shift tilde, but now is a button that users can click where you can choose to rotate it inside. And these shapes are pretty much mirrored on the Z because they're pretty much solidified, flattened shapes, so flipping them on the Z isn't going to do anything, but being able to scroll through them just readily on the fly is just something that was previously not accessible with Boxcutter and is probably one of the biggest things. So we just click to apply, we'll just click and drag to create another box here, and we could press D, just click through our collection, bring out a couple of custom shapes, click and we're done. We'll do the same thing on this side, press D, choose which one we want, maybe rotate it inside, and we see that we still have options for the origins that are being set by us whenever we scale. But if you want to adjust the draw origin in terms of dimensions, they are available here, but those options do get moved out of the way in order to make room for this, because it does take greater precedence during draw. Normally you're not trying to change your drawing to center draw in the middle of your drawing, but if you are, we do still offer an override for that. But this is one of my favorite aspects of Boxcutter, and it's connected with collection. So whenever you're using Boxcutter, if you have shapes that you like in a collection, you can now mark them as a collection. You can unmark it as a collection, which means that now whenever we draw shapes, we are actually recalling them from the cutters collection. So I could just press C and we can cycle through our custom cutters to see what we get, and eventually we'll get to those shapes that we had previously. But if we want to get back to those previous shapes that we had that were in a dedicated collection to scroll through, we're able to do that just by setting up our recall collection, and now I can press C and cycle through them. But if you're not a fan of the hotkeys, or even just pressing Alt Scroll, which is just one of my favorites in Boxcutter, from either changing shapes or changing shapes like we're talking about here, you're also able to do it inside of the D helper. But that's one of the reasons that collection is one of the prime options at the top of Boxcutter. If we click on collection being highlighted, we see that we're able to go in and actually specify specific things about Boxcutter. For example, what collection we're placing our cutters in, what collection we're recalling, and even if we want to cycle all cutters, which was a big emphasis on a previous release. By checking this, you can make it toggle only cutters that have interesting names, or if you have it off, it will toggle through every cutter named cube, box, box 001, box 002, and so on. But by having this off, you can actually make it only cycle through prime cutters. But if you're unaware of it, you probably want to leave it on by default so you ensure that you see the shape that you want to see. But we want to emphasize over custom cutter collections and being able to control them on the fly in future releases. But this is just one of the first steps, is putting it first and foremost to users to be able to get in and get the most out of using reusable collections. So the next slider we must talk about is the rotation slider. So on this, we have nothing but presets, and all it has to deal with is how it rotates whenever you press R. So by default, I believe it's on 15, meaning that if we were to just draw a shape and we press R, we see that we're snapping at 15-degree increments. We could always just pause it, press D, jump in and change this to something like 90, and we press R and we see that we're actually snapping to 90. But in the event that you want to snap it to something finer, even during rotate, you can hold shift and it will allow you to override the rotation to actually do some fine rotation. So sometimes you can get it almost approximate, and then you may have to rotate it just slightly to get it exactly where you want. But just in case you ever need to customize it, you're able to do that on the fly just by holding shift. If we click on 30, we see that we're back at 30, and by just canceling that shape and redrawing it, we can now rotate our shape at 30. So rotation is there just to help you find a rotation amount snap that works for you whenever it comes to simplifying the rotation in Boxcutter. And all the options are presets, because more than likely you just want to get in, click which one you need, and get back to work. So whenever it comes to Blender, if you're using a latter version, the Boolean modifier now has multiple solvers. And knowing which solver that you're using on the fly is important, because fast is, well, very fast, and exact is pretty nice, but it can definitely have some speed implications if you're unaware of it and you're using it on cuts that were simply better suited for fast. So let's just cancel this. One of the things about Boxcutter is the notifications. We see the notifications here at the bottom, and one of the things that I found important enough to emphasize is which solver that you're using. On the fly, you may find yourself wanting to change your solver, so now we have the solver option exposed. I have a sneaking suspicion that someday we'll have only one solver and we'll be removing the slider in the future. But for now, while we're in this moment, we have an option between toggling fast and exact on the fly. So you could even draw a cut, press D, go in, change it to exact, and now as we're extruding, you see that the notification is displaying that this is exact. So sometimes I'll be working and have it in exact and not be paying attention, and the only way I'll be able to tell is that there's just a very large speed hit later, or I just have booleans that are very dependent on each other, and I'm like, oh man, I've built a model that is dependent on exact, which prompts me to have to smart apply in order to get my speed back. But just being aware of your solver can go a long ways towards helping you get the most out of your Boxcutter experience, because exact can be good to party on for a while, but I find it to also be very interesting as a computer benchmark for how much exact booleans your computer can take before they begin choking other modifiers to death. But right now I'm cutting, and we see that with every cut the speed hit just gets a little bit more intense whenever it comes to using the exact solver. But you can change the hotkey for it on the fly, even in the middle of your cut with Alt-E. But in the event that you want to do it inside the D panel, you can also just press D, go in Helper, and change your solver to exactly what you need it to be. And because we already have so many exact booleans on this, we're not able to get any sort of speed increase back. Or if we are getting a speed increase, it's negligible. So really the most optimal option for me would be to go into the HardOps helper, go to the Booleans Bevel subtab, and change everything over to fast. And now I can actually cut and it performs properly and fast. Laser cut is the designation given to our system that calculates cutting all the way through the mesh. Right here I am drawing a 2D shape. However, if I do not extrude and I just click, it cuts through the shape. And if we use Everscroll to recall this cutter, we can see that the cutter is nicely proportioned to fit the shape. And the system that makes that work is called AccuCut. It just knows how far to cut through the shape. And this works in a variety of methods. I mean, if we wanted to get crazy with it, we could take this shape, rotate it out in space, get all nuts with it, and still draw, and it will still be able to calculate an accurate Accu shape, which is one of my favorite ways of testing this tool. However, what if you wanted AccuCut to not cut all the way through your shape? Well, by pressing D, you can go to the laser cut option, and by typing in something like, say, 0.35, we're now cutting 0.35 meters through this. And let's change our solver to exact to just make it a little bit more sane for us. And now whenever we click and we apply, we're now cutting to 0.35 depth. So all of our cuts are meeting, and because we're using the exact solver, they meet nicely, which is one of the benefits of using exact. Sometimes there's cases in which exact is definitely the only solver that can solve a particular case, and those are the cases in which you should definitely take the speed hit in order to enjoy the luxuries of the exact solver. But in cases in which it's not needed, it's definitely not recommended. But we can see that we're able to just cut consistently to a depth that's able to just be adhered to by laser cut. So instead of just cutting all the way through the shape, we're able to limit our cut. And that's one of the first features related with laser cut depth. So if we just change this to 0, we've basically reset it. And so now we can actually talk about this toggle at the end. This toggle will turn laser cut into AccuDepth. AccuDepth is a modification of the AccuCut system in which we wanted to try to create a automatic depth situation. So by toggling on auto depth in the D helper, it changes the way that you draw shapes. In fact, I'm going to need to make a new file in order to press D and change my solver to fast, and then we could talk about this in a more focused fashion without speed hits, stuttering everything that I'm trying to do. So now that we have activated auto depth, that means whenever we click and drag, we're now able to have our depth automatically specified via a multiplier based on the longest edge of the draw. So it's very different than AccuCut depth. However, this one is definitely one worth getting in and playing with, especially if you're just trying to perform a bunch of cuts in quick succession without having to get in and deal with any of the rigmarole that's associated with depth and having to think about it and deal with that final click. With this, we can just get in, just keep pressing W to change our wedge if we wanted, press Alt VE in order to get better shading, but just like that, we're able to just quickly draw cuts without having to even think about the overhead of dealing with depth. And that's really the beauty of what auto depth is all about. One of my favorite parts about it is that if we were to change it to something like 0.3, we're now going to be drawing at a third of the depth that we were previously using. So if we were to change this to say something like join, that means that we can now draw join boxes that are now sticking out, not as far as they would have if we would have left that setting at 1. So in the event that you're needing to draw sequential shapes but also need to put some sort of multiplier or divisor on it, you're able to do that from the comfort of the D helper. These options pertain to flipping the depth around, so if you wanted to calculate based on the larger depth of the edge, you can do that, which will result in a larger shape because it's calculating based on the alternative edge than it was previously. But for the most part, I find that just keeping things at default and changing this parameter gets me to where I need to go to. The last option to talk about is the custom proportions, which is really, to me, the future of what Custom Cutter is going to become. You're eventually going to be able to draw shape and there won't be any depth to have to think about. We don't want to draw in green or in join, so we'll change that to cut. But there will come a day when you will be able to just draw custom just like this without having to even toggle auto depth, just it by itself. However, with custom, there are a series of additional behaviors that I want to deal with first and also allow to still be available before we start one-to-one users, because I mean, you can always hold shift and move things freely, so we still want users to be able to enjoy that flexibility as well. But whenever you use shift to proportionally move things, it also activates shift to live, causing me to have to press 1 to jump back to my original layer. But just letting you know that auto depth is available for you, and it also expands all the way to custom in the event that you want to just draw custom shapes without even having to worry about any sort of automatic depth calculation. You want to just draw it 1-to-1 of its original shape. All you have to do is just activate the custom proportions and it will be 1-to-1. Otherwise, it will use the longest edge to calculate depth just like it would with any of the other shapes. But for that reason, that is why laser cut and auto depth is part of the new BoxHelper as sliders. So the last slider we'll be talking about will be the material slider. So if we press D and we look at our helper, we're able to basically choose what material we're assigning whenever we cut. We see that we have two very boring materials. None of them are really worth selecting. Of course, material cut is available if you have both HardOps and Boxcutter. So for this, let's duplicate our cube with Shift D, and we'll just hit this cube with a sphere cast, and let's just duplicate it around a couple of times. With Shift D, we'll select all of them, press Alt M, and let's control click blank material, just give them a blank material. Now we can actually just click on our material drop down and choose a material. which means that whenever we cut, we're forcing that material on the mesh. Whenever it comes to material cut, seeing your material in the viewport can be a little hard with the tint of the shader cutter. And for that reason, that's why you would press H in order to look at things in a wireframe fashion. Sometimes I just cut like this because it's just a lot easier to just see exactly what's going on with my mesh than it is to be alerted by the color of my cutter. But just like that, I can easily go in here and change my cutter on the fly and decide what color I want my material cut to be. Of course, keep in mind that whenever it comes to things like inset, great care has been taken to make inset actually draw the way it's supposed to on the surface by setting up the rim settings just right. So if you are using material cut, you'll find that it's definitely very nice whenever it comes to inset. So another thing about material cut to note is that if I were to just clear it out like you saw me do by clicking the X, and we were to go in here and just specify a material, we see that that material doesn't actually occur during this cut. But if I were to press tab and move the cutter, we see that it also doesn't take place. It requires at this time that we cancel the cut and actually draw the cut again in order to add the material. However, let's actually go into Helper, remove the material, and draw this cutter, and we can just press tab, and if we press D, we can specify a material. We see a notification showing for us specifying material, but we don't see it update. The thing about material cut is it does have the hotkey of M, so just by pressing M in the 3D view, you can actually cycle through the available materials on your material cut in order to assign it, and for some reason that is actually more responsive than the D helper at this time whenever it comes to material cut. So it works great if you're specifying your material in advance, but if you are using it in the middle of a cut, it is something that we will be checking into. It was one of the final things brought up about the helper, but the response of what we'll need to do is definitely a little bit more involved than I'm wanting to go through in this particular quarter. So whenever it comes to modifiers, as specified before, they are currently start states, meaning that you can only choose them one by one when it comes to starting off your shape draw with them. So if you want to, for example, draw a solidified box, you can. And then if you wanted to bevel it, you could always just either tab it and just grab the bevel dot, or you could just press D and add a bevel to the mesh by just clicking on bevel and adjusting it in the viewport, and then pausing it with left click afterwards, and then pressing D in order to go back into your helper to adjust that shape intimately. If we wanted to add a Q bevel, we can, and then we can flip it, and we're able to still do this even with the solidify present. We can always just remove the solidify, but for the most part, whenever it comes to dealing with solidification, it really is just that easy to deal with it when it comes to getting started with Boxcutter. We see that with our top normal flipped, we have things acting a little bit weird. So by clicking on the flip Z button, we can get things actually back on track, even though we probably should have just canceled and redrawn the shape. Another thing about Solidify is that in the event that you are using inset, Solidify is automatically available and there's no way to remove it except for right there where I removed it. But if we click and drag, we create our shape, and then when we press D, there's solidification. We can click X, and this time it will not let us remove it because we are in inset. Clicking X would actually possibly need to switch us back over to cut and thus remove the ability to have the inset. But just letting you know that whenever you're using inset, Solidify will automatically show by default, so that way you can get in and adjust your thickness, because Solidify is integral to the inset operation. There is no way to do inset without duplicating the mesh, solidifying it, doing a slice on it, and then cutting it back into the original mesh, or basically what we call inset. Generally, when you're in Boxcutter, you can just draw a shape, and you could press 1 for X mirror, 2 for Y mirror, 3 for Z mirror. However, you can also use the mini helper to add a mirror modifier to your mesh. As we see, it used the same settings that were specified when I used the hotkeys. But even more importantly, you can go in and flip axes on the fly if needed, or choose which ones you need to bisect. Sometimes you need to bisect in order to make your cut work. We've now exposed all these settings to users on the fly, so in a way, I consider it a pretty big expansion on the way that mirror is handled inside of Boxcutter. In fact, just being able to go in and choose the axis on the fly and toggle them off and on is just something that is just a sight to behold, because previously telling people to have to press 1, 2, and 3 felt like a little bit of a pro move. So I'm happy to see that it's been simplified and consolidated into one easy to deal with slider. In the event that you're not able to press D to bring up your helper, press tab, of course, to pause. But now we have all the mirror options just consolidated in one easy to use slider, and you can just remove it at your own whim inside the box helper. So with Boxcutter, we're just going to select our shape and hold Control to bring up our dots and just draw out a center drawn area. And we'll press V in order to activate array. So array has always been on V, and special care has been taken to avoid shapes from intersecting with themselves. But another thing about array is that pressing V again will activate radial array, which will make it radiate around the area in which you drew it. So a thing that's interesting about array is that you typically want to draw from the center of where you want to radiate your shape around, and then you can press V to array and then V to radial array, and you're now radial arraying around the area in which you initially drew. So with this version, we wanted to make Boxcutter easier to use, so let's just draw our shape, tap to pause, and if we press D and just go inside array, we've now activated array, but we have to move our mouse in order to adjust our distance. We'll pause it again, press D, go back in our helper, and from here we can actually choose to radial array and even adjust our distance on the fly. So instead of having to rely on the hotkeys, you can now get in and actually do this just on the fly by dealing with the array slider intimately. Of course, keep in mind that since this is a modal interaction that's being triggered, that you may have to move your mouse over to 3D view in order to get it configured, or at least pre-started, for you to then go in and make fine edits using the mini helper. Traditionally, whenever you're using Bevel, when it came to Boxcutter, you would draw your shape, and then you could press B in order to bevel. But you also had the ability to press Q during bevel in order to add what's called a Q bevel. The thing about our bevel is whenever you bring the points all the way in and bring them back out, it converts from a bevel to a chamfer and vice versa. So that's one quick way to just jump between one segment and 6 segments on the fly whenever you're dealing with bevel. But another thing about Q bevel is that it gave way for us to be able to do a reverse bevel. So reverse bevel is actually us pressing Shift F and basically flipping the shape. However, if we move the bevel dot, we see that whenever we adjust the chamfer, that it's not looking so good on the reverse bevel, because we actually want the reverse bevel to have one segment and we want the rest of the shape to actually remain smooth. But with our previous configuration methods, that wasn't actually possible. However, if we press D and bring up the mini helper, we see that we're now able to do such things. So we can actually go to the second bevel and adjust the settings independently, and also even adjust its width. We see that as we adjust the width, it's not able to go past a certain distance due to a clamp on the bevel. By clicking this lock, we can actually unclamp it and move this past dimensions that are previously unable to even be obtained to get a larger than life bevel happening. And so this is the level of control that is now available to users whenever they use the bevel modifier inside of Boxcutter via the new helper. So let's just right click and cancel, and let's talk about doing this without any hotkeys whatsoever. So we just draw a shape, extrude, pause with tab, press D, click on bevel. Let's just control roll some segments. We click on this option to bevel the back face. Maybe have to click it twice in order to trigger it. And then from here we have a secondary bevel where its option is actually to flip the bevel, which gives us this shape. And from here we can actually make fine adjustments. So one day we'll get to the point where we'll be drawing reverse bevels by default. But due to us having flipped the normals, it is a bit of a conundrum with the ability to draw flip normal shapes in an inverted direction when we have systems built in place to prevent such things. So for that reason, it is currently a stepped process, but we wanted to make it as seamless as possible for users of all skill levels to be able to get in and enjoy reverse beveling. In fact, let's just click and apply. We could press D, switch over to circle. Let's just draw a circle, press tab. We could press D, jump over to bevel, click on the reverse icon, and there we are, just affecting our reverse bevel on this particular circle. Of course, we can move our mouse off in order to adjust this thing independently via clicking, since we did trigger a modal interaction. So now we have our reverse bevel going with this shape. So the only shape that doesn't have reverse bevel is N-gon. So to just demonstrate it in action, what we would get with it is, let's just draw an N-gon shape, bring it in, we'll press D, we'll choose to bevel, where we'll just go into 3D view and roll our mouse to adjust the segments, repause it and re-enter, and we'll add a Q bevel, and let's just try flipping it. So we see that because it doesn't have reverse bevel, it actually just flips the shape on the Z instead of flipping the normal and then flipping the shape on the Z, which is actually what happens with the other shapes. So a system will have to be made for that. But with each tool that we're adding it to, with each shape, it does get a little bit more tricky as far as the solutions and keeping them fluid with previous solutions of the past. So its day will come, but just keep in mind that reverse bevel doesn't support N-gon at this time, but Q bevel does. So whenever it comes to the bevel slider and the D-helper, there's a little bit more in depth that we can talk about with it. Generally, whenever you have bevel enabled and you don't have backface beveling enabled, that means that whenever you draw a shape, you're beveling it on a 2D level, basically resulting in a 2D cut. However, if we were to tap this to live and press D, we are able to, from here, click the bevel backface, and we could also choose to basically reverse the bevel, giving us a reversed bevel result. So this is something that should be fairly straightforward as of this version of Boxcutter. However, let's talk about it a little bit more in depth. If we press D, we see that the Q bevel is already activated, and there's an additional option where instead of beveling the back face, we can also choose to bevel the front face, and that will do exactly what you think it does. If we click and drag, we are now creating a beveled box that's now being beveled on both the interior face and the exterior face, as well as on every single edge. So if we press tab, we can drop this shape, press D, go into the helper, and we see that we now have 3 options at our disposal. So we can just hold control and scroll to adjust the bevel for the main bevel. We can add some segments to the lower bevel if desired, and we can even increase the width of the upper bevel. We see that we're not able to take it very far due to the limitations on the clamp overlap. So by clicking this icon, we're able to simply unlock it, and just like that, we're able to draw a reverse beveled box without having to go through the process of having to click through the button. So to show it again, with those settings already enabled, all we have to do is just draw a box, and that box is already set up. However, we can see from this cut that more than likely we'll be needing to revisit the way that reverse bevel on a start position is actually initialized in the future, so that we can maintain a good curvature on the outside and keep the simplified bevels happening for both the interior and the exterior bevels. Another aspect we can talk about is circle. So if we click on circle, we see that circle also has the same bevel back face, bevel front face behavior. So if we were to basically click and drag to create a circle, we see our shaders inverted, and whenever we click and drag, we are now drawing a reverse beveled circle that's beveled on both the interior and exterior. However, because the reverse bevel system is still very new and its integration with circles incomplete, we see that instead of having 2 modifiers as you would probably desire, we only have 1. And whenever we adjust the settings for it, we're actually adjusting only the segments at the bottom, but we're able to deal with the bevel of both of them together whenever we're dealing with the width. So this is a bug of sorts. However, we will be resolving this in the future, aiming to give you individual control over bevels whenever it comes to things. So when it comes to dealing with bevel both front face and back face, it is something fairly new to Boxcutter when it comes to reverse bevel. So it's definitely one of those things that you'll just have to see how it expands on future releases. So if we click to apply, that's complete. And another thing I want to talk about is N-gon. N-gon's one of my favorites whenever it comes to using bevel. However, it's not my favorite when it comes to using the Q bevel or the back face bevel, so we'll just uncheck that. And what I mean by liking N-gon with bevel is that we can draw shapes, and we see that this shape is actually already beveled whenever it comes to N-gon. So while the bevel is actually not looking very good at this particular second because we have simplified segments, we are able to snap as if we're not beveling, and we could even press D to bring up our helper and adjust the amount of segments that we're seeing, lower the amount of distance that we're getting here, and let's even right click and cancel or press escape to completely cancel and just basically redraw this N-gon. So now we're actually getting rounded points as we're creating this shape, and this is something that I didn't notice was resolved in a previous update to Boxcutter, was the ability to actually draw beveled N-gons on the fly. A popular question that we get with users is how do you deal with the particular beveling of individual points at this time, and the answer is that you simply have to shift it to live and actually use HardOps for it at this moment. But one of the next things on our list is definitely getting back to dealing with N-gon points. So to show that in action, let's say I actually wanted to minimize or mitigate some of the bevel amounts that I have on some of these edges. Well, I can just tab into edit mode, press 2 to go into edge mode, select a couple of edges that we want to lower the bevel amount on, and if we just alt click mark, we're able to just lower the bevel weight. So whenever it comes to us automating the points to be able to control this, it's the same situation. It's just going to be us controlling the bevel weights of these individuals, but we can take it down to 0, which basically results in it getting no bevel, and we keep our bevel just isolated to this one particular area. But in a nutshell, just wanted to do a little bit more talking about Bevel and its approach with Boxcutter and how you can utilize it to the fullest when it comes to Bevel front face and Bevel back face, which is only available with certain aspects of Boxcutter. For example, with N-gon, we don't have reverse bevel capability, so you see that another option doesn't actually enable itself. But if we were to jump over to Box and we go into Bevel, we see that there is an option for us to bevel the front face on the way in. But keep in mind that by unchecking this, you can just get in and select your shape and draw, and it will just bevel with a Q bevel just on the interior on the way in. And then if you want to flip it, of course, you can always just press D, choose the reverse bevel button, and from there you have a reverse bevel that you're able to adjust, unclamp, and fix to perfection. So it's important to note that while we designed the helper to basically be like the HardOps, which is a lot more static in its interactions because it's not activating modals in the middle of its usage, the Boxcutter helper is definitely nothing like that. So even though you're able to basically set up modifiers and remove them on the fly and things like that, it's aimed to be done during the draw, and it's definitely not a modifier helper of sorts. It's more like an in-tool assistant for Boxcutter during the method of drawing, and also helping dealing with configurations pre-draw. So you may notice some strange things about it when you try to use it like a helper. Like for example, we can go in and we could toggle wedge easily. We can go in and play with the width. We can click through the various presets for wedge to basically get it to look exactly the way that we want. However, whenever we click things like bevel, there's either a chance that it's going to come up and we're not going to see any sort of interaction, because we need to actually mouse over to 3D view in order to trigger it, because a lot of these things are still connected to modals. And so on a technical level, these are things that you will need to take into consideration whenever you're using it. But for the most part, once you get used to the way that things are, you should definitely be able to use this thing at the speed of light. In fact, just being able to get in and just quickly remove things from a mesh is just one of my favorites. Being able to reverse bevel was one of our goals that we set out to do with this thing, to make it as streamlined as possible. You know, one of the questions I get the most is, how do you draw an N-gon line? And so we aim to try to simplify it with this particular version of the helper, where basically users would see an icon representing cyclic that by checking it would actually change the name to say N-gon line. We tried to solve it in the past by actually doing the same thing up here in the top bar. I don't know if users are aware that just by clicking this icon, you can toggle into N-gon line. And just like that, you're drawing an N-gon line. I can right click and pause at that last point. I can press D to bring up my mini helper and just expand to deal with my solidify in a more intimate fashion. If I want to extrude, I can either close this and rotate my view and press E, or if I'm using view extrude, I can just press E and move my mouse to cut through. But really at this point, you also have the ability to just drag the extrusion on a Z, which is why this is so emphasized. By being able to get in and deal with your dimension intimately, I'm hoping to add a additional level of control. Previously, we also had dimensions capable inside the previous helper, but they weren't as well emphasized. But just being able to go in here and choose, say, I want to be under center draw, and I want to change my dimensions to be 2 feet by 4 feet, and I want a depth of, say, 3 feet. And being able to type these things in should give users a level of control as far as getting particular dimensions whenever it comes to using Boxcutter with a degree of accuracy. However, whenever it comes to Booleans, of course, sometimes the mesh is more dictatorial of the result than it is you actually being precise with your measurements, especially if you're dealing with hot lines and things like that and you're using the wrong solver. But I just wanted to do a final note just talking about some of the nuances of the helper and how you can actually get the most out of it, because if you're, say, just drawing a shape and you decide to just go in and add an array, well, array is a modal operation. So you see that as I'm moving the mouse, the notification at the bottom is being updated because it's still reading my movements, meaning that I need to get into 3D view and actually just make some movements to get this actually situated. And then from there, I'm able to press tab and pause, press D, and go back in and actually adjust the distances more intimately. And then of course, radial array is now available as a button for you to toggle through, which is previously unavailable in Boxcutter, but definitely a sign that we are going to be expanding on radial array in the future. One of my favorite things about the array slider is that whenever you jump into radial array, we see that it is simplified for us to be able to just quickly get in and adjust our count, don't want to make swastikas, and also be able to adjust our distance on the fly. So just being able to get in and do these things without having to press a hotkey to trigger a modal interaction is definitely something of a step up, but we'll be improving this over and over over in the future, and of course adding more sliders and deepening the lore, but we want this to be a central area for users to be able to get acquainted with everything that Boxcutter has to offer. Another slider of pertinence I want to talk about is the taper behavior, because typically when you want a wedge, you can just go under the shape settings and you can activate wedge. However, when it comes to dealing with taper, we actually look at taper more like a modifier, where you can set it up as a start state and then you would specify your settings, and you can even specify your persistence. So because of that, code-wise, it actually behaves a little bit differently than you would expect with taper, despite it actually being next to it. So that means that whenever you're drawing with taper, you could draw a shape, it'll taper, and then it's completed, right? And if you press D, we see that taper, the icon, is still enabled, but taper, the actual slider, is unavailable. And this means that we were previously on taper, but we're not tapering anymore. So if we click and drag and create a shape, we're not actually tapering this shape on the fly. And that's because taper actually has a behavior attached to it of persistence, where basically if you activate persistence on taper, whenever you click and drag and create a shape, it will have persistent taper across every shape. But typically with taper, at the time that we were designing it, we figured that you would only want to use taper for certain shapes, and then from there revert back to a non-tapered shape, especially in the event that you are switching shapes over to, say, something like circle. You definitely don't want taper to persist there. But let's just jump back over to Box and activate taper, and we see that now we have the persistent taper icon checked, which means that if we set ourselves to 0.5 and we click and drag, we create a shape. If we click and drag again, we create another shape that's also tapered. We see that all these shapes that I'm drawing are just tapered, but if we press D and we go back in, we also see that the taper slider doesn't actually go away. So there were a few strange things about the helper that we found as we assembled it, because like I may have mentioned at the beginning, Boxcutter wasn't really optimized to be put together in such a fashion. However, I see now that the point has come that we should definitely try to unify everything in a way that every user should be able to have access to it without having to know about hotkeys or additional features, or have to watch videos or go through documentation, and also present Boxcutter in an easy to digest method. Also, shape purity is in effect. What this means is that if you were to, say, draw a box, press D, and change over to a taper and a wedge, you are now drawing a wedge box. However, if you paid attention previously, you know that in order to get taper to persist, you have to click on persistent taper, and then you can draw a tapered box persistently. However, if you were to change shapes over to something like circle, we see that wedge and taper have went away. If we were to activate wedge and taper on circle and we jump over to N-gon, we see that those states have been reset. This is what I refer to as shape purity. Is to prevent you from drawing a wedge box and then accidentally drawing a wedge circle. So for example, you may want to draw a wedge box because that's what wedge was made for. However, if you were to just jump over to circle and actually draw a wedge circle, you'll find that wedge circles just don't actually look that good. I'm still wondering what we can do with wedge and circle in order to give it a happy ending. However, at this time, I'm just not pleased with the ability for wedge to generate Ovaltine circles inside of circles whenever we're wedging them. However, it is wedge doing what wedge is supposed to do. But when it comes to Boxcutter, our goal is to ensure that when you jump to a shape, it jumps to the specific version of that shape. So if you are in circle, you are in circle. If you jump from circle to N-gon, you are drawing a closed N-gon every time. That means that if you were to, say, draw an N-gon line, but you exit to go to circle, but you decide to go back to N-gon, you are once again drawing a closed N-gon, because N-gon is the specified shape that this icon is delegated to. Having subtypes actually jump to by default would result in a more jarring experience, especially if users aren't aware that there's toggles for toggling line and lasso off and on. So just letting you know that whenever you jump between shapes, they will be reset to their default states, and this is by design because we want Boxcutter to be a very focused and organized experience, especially whenever you're cycling through your shapes. Obviously, the best way to cycle through your shapes is to hold Alt and scroll, which is my favorite way to go through all the shapes that Boxcutter has to offer.